Hello, everyone. You're joining us for another Theory U Around the World series, where Yael and I, co-founders of Bidu, have conversations with some remarkable practitioners who work with Theory U in various countries and fields, and are very generous to share with us their knowledge and experience. Today, we have the great privilege of hosting Alperin Solms, who is not only a colleague, but a very, very dear friend. Thanks you for being with us, Liz. Liz is an active member of the Presencing Institute team, focusing on translating Theory U to practice in organizational and collective impact contexts. She's also the co-founder of Insight Parks, a Theory U-based strategy and leadership consulting firm that works with leaders within and across sectors to address their most critical issues. We invited Liz today to talk about experience in co-leading the UN SDG, that means Sustainable Development Goals, Leadership Lab in Liberia. So far, the Presencing Institute, the organization that leads the work with Theory U around the world, has completed 26 labs in collaboration with the UN in various countries in Latin America and Africa. So welcome, Liz. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you so much, both of you. It's such an honor and privilege to be with you.
Thank you. We will start with a little broader perspective, and then we will go into more specific questions maybe. And I want to ask you first about the context for the process. What was it, the UN lab in Liberia? What led to its initiation? What was the purpose of the process?
Thanks for that question. So I'll explain just an ounce about why the UN is taking on this project globally. The way the UN works, for folks who don't know, is that in any country, there could be 20 or 25 UN agencies working in that country. And each one of those UN agencies, their leadership reports to Geneva or to New York, but they don't have a natural motivation to collaborate with one another. So the UN realized this a few years ago, maybe 6 or 8 years ago, and put in place a structure called the resident coordinators. So they put someone in each country whose job is they don't have authority over the UN leaders for each of the agencies, but they have influence to coordinate. So the Presencing Institute was brought in to work with what's called the UN country team, the leadership within a country, to focus on a specific challenge that's important to them so that they might align and act in unison. Because everyone knows that the SDGs are not achievable if everyone's doing their own special thing. In the country of Liberia, there was a deep readiness to take on this challenge. For those people who don't know, Liberia is the only country in Africa that was colonized by Americans. It was the first country to achieve, it was formerly enslaved Americans who colonized the country in the early 1800s. It was the first country in Africa to achieve independence. And it has a fascinating history, but a dark history. There was many years of civil war. It's been 20 years, one of the bloodiest, deadliest civil wars in the history of humanity. And the UN had been very involved in peacekeeping in Liberia. In fact, there is no country that the UN had put more money in peacekeeping funds anywhere in the world than Liberia. And yet, when we came into this lab a few years ago, the statistics were really demoralizing. There was a high level of poverty. I think I have the statistics if you want me to get them. I don't typically remember them off the top of my head. Most children, school-age children, were not in school. It's a country with rich resources, good agriculture, a lot of mining, had historically had terrific health care. It had been really a center of Africa. And now it was really, in spoils, like really in a bad place. So the country, the resident coordinator, his name was Niels, said to us, we have to stop doing yesterday better. Here we are, we have all these resources in this country, so much credibility. The UN, as you know, does not have credibility in every country that it operates. In Liberia, it does. In some ways, it's an extension of the government in delivering services. And yet, still these, immense poverty. So we were brought in to work with the country team. And the task that, there were a couple tasks. One is stop doing yesterday better. Like, we really need to break the pattern. Number two was that corruption is a huge force in Liberia. And so that was kind of what we were told we should focus the lab on, like to get underneath and think differently about the factors of corruption. Our promise, we came in, there's 3 of us from PI who worked on this project. Myself, my colleague Teo and Sharon, and we came in, and our promise to the folks, to the 20 to 25 leaders of the UN was, we said, we'll give you time and space to see and sense your system, to like understand what's at the heart of the matter of this terrible blockage, not able to make any progress. We'll give you a common agenda for how you might work forward together. So some acupuncture points. We'll give you time and space to work on your own personal transformation as a leader. And we'll come out of this lab with prototypes that move you in the direction of something different, and just time and space to step out of the madness and really think together. That was our promise, and that was what we're called in to do.
Yeah, that's a very helpful context. I think just getting us to the UN projects and to the projects of Liberia. Can you give us a bit of, kind of walk us through the outline of what actually you did? And so how did it look? What was the process like?
Yeah, thanks. Thank you so much for asking that question, Danielle. I think it's that's really a great thing to talk to PI practitioners about. So I will say that from the minute we got into this lab, we had, I hope this is not overstating or too uncomfortable to hear, we had a heart connection with Niels. I don't know what to tell you other than listening to him and feeling his readiness and his like, we got to stop, we got to do something different here. This man, it was a real professional. He was a seasoned, he had led all of the relief work in Haiti after their earthquake. He knew what he was doing. He was a consummate professional, and yet he was stuck. And when we came in and said, we're with you, we're going to like be with you, we're going to be your partners on this journey, whatever you need, we're going to do this together. And he said something to us in the very beginning. He said, it feels like we are underground, almost in a mine, doing our work, the UN country team. And thank you for that little bit of light you just shined in saying that you care. So I will say that that was a piece of what we did from the very beginning, was to care. But the activities that we did, we interviewed every single member of the UN country team between 30 minutes and an hour. We spent time with each of them listening to their personal story before we got into the work of seeing Liberia through their eyes and getting their hopes for this lab. That was the first thing we did. Second thing we did was from the beginning, this was post-COVID, and the leader said, this lab needs to be in person, enough with Zoom, no patience for Zoom. But we said, let's do a co-initiation on Zoom. So we did a 2-hour Zoom with the UN country team. In that Zoom, what we did was we, among other things, was we took the quotes from the interviews that we had done, and we layered them into the iceberg and showed them how their understanding mapped to the layers of reality of the UN in Liberia. I'll say to you that the UN is very, that's what I'm looking for, administrative, programmatic, intellectual, smart people with big passion, but everything they do is very academic. We talked from the heart, and some of those quotes were very personal, and we named some hard truths. What we did is we did a little bit of a voices from the field. So we read those quotes. We read direct quotes from the interviews through the lens of the iceberg. And from the very beginning, you can sense there was like a little bit of silence, like, whoa, this is different. This is something different. That bought us credibility, so that when we went to do our first lab, it was in November of 2022. It was a 3-day lab. They had decided only with the country team. We explored the idea of going wider in the ecosystem. They said, no, we need our own conversations with nobody else there first. So when we got together, some of the first things we did was in the co-initiating was we had people in quads, groups of 4, and we had them talk about the narratives of the country. What is your story of the history of Liberia? That was one of the things we asked. And another thing we asked was, to whom do you dedicate this work? And we also had them start to think about what are some potential shifts that might be interesting in how the UN operates in Liberia. So those three questions got right to the heart of the matter and opened up some interesting territory right from the beginning. The second thing we did, so people were, moved and connected. The second thing we did was we took the iceberg and we expanded it. We built a physical iceberg on the floor with tape and Post-its, and had people really step into the different aspects of the iceberg that they created. They using Post-its, co-created themselves. In that moment, there was you could see the awareness. People saying, "Oh my God, we built a plan based on our thinking and analysis, and this is the conversation we should have had," because they started thinking in that moment around the shifts in mindset. So some quotes came up. People started saying things like, there was only a few Liberians in the team. The country team is international. But one of the Liberians said something like, "Oh, Liberia, you are my problem child." And that kind of, I don't know, it did something to the group. Also, in that moment, we remember we're there to talk about corruption. And what came out in addition to corruption was a culture of dependency and an awareness. It's like there is a culture of dependency. Everybody is counting on somebody else to make things work. And guess what? The UN, are part of the problem. So they said that to each other, starting with that iceberg. Then we did Voices of the Field, which you all know. Yeah. And we had voices of young people, voices of the business sector, voices of the person who's engaging in corruption. And everybody saying, "Oh, please help me, I'm sorry," all of these kinds of things you'd expect to hear in Voices of the Field. Then we had a pause and said, "What meaning do you make of this?" And this was a big turn. One of the UN leaders said, "Everybody comes to us all the time to help, and that is the problem. We need to say no to the direct requests for help and instead position the country to help." So that was a big shift too. By the way, we're just a day into this thing. Did you want to say something?
It sounds already from what you mentioned that from one of the shifts that happened is their repositioning their role in the country. Is that what happened?
Total. And in fairness, I should have said that at the onset. We came in knowing that was our biggest leverage point, and that they were open to it. We said, "Is this something you're willing to do? Are you willing to reposition the role of the UN in this country in order to get better results?" And they said, "Yes, we are." And we absolutely, so they were open to that, but they started to see how that might be necessary and how they might.
Say a bit more about what that actually means. So reposition, what's the shift from what position to what position, and how does that play out then?
The government of Liberia, the national government, is centered in Monrovia, the capital. This is not a big country. It's under 8 million people. There are something like, I want to say 15 counties that are spread all over the country that have a ton of resource and ton of people. And there is very little infrastructure to connect the capital with the counties, going as far as during the rainy season, which is a lot of the year, you cannot travel to those counties. So what happens is all of the UN's attention had been focused on the national government of Liberia. That was one of the big shifts that came out of this work. A second shift is the UN had been in peacekeeping mode, so in the mode of directly intervening and doing things, including delivering services, delivering education, delivering food, delivering healthcare supplies, actually providing government services, doing all those things. And so another one of the big shifts, as guided by the national government, one of the other big shifts was to turn their gaze from the national government to the counties and local government and civil society, and to look more locally for guidance. That was another one of the shifts. and to stop coming in and being the expert, but instead listen to local wisdom. So to hold back on the instinct to direct, but rather to support local leaders in pointing the way for Liberia. The other big shift that came out was there was a recognition that because of this connection with the US, many leaders in Liberia either have a residence in the United States or their dream is going to the everybody wants to go to the United States. During elections, because of the history of civil war, many people in power leave the country during elections because they're afraid of the violence that might ensue. So one of the other big shifts there were 4 big shifts that they decided on this lab. One of the other ones was to help the country tell its own narrative of one Liberia that they want to stand behind. A narrative of patriotism, of pride, of owning our future. That was one of the other big shifts. And in fact, the UN had never really done anything like that. The decision that, go to the end, one of the decisions they made is to work with cultural leaders, influencers, sports leaders, people in media, and engage them in a PR campaign to tell a different story of the future of Liberia. So the fourth shift was around the way funding works, the way they do development funding. It's kind of a technical solution, but a very important one in terms of how they do partnership. So those were the 4 big shifts that they landed on after 3 days.
Yeah, this is very, very powerful. Sounds very powerful, very inspiring, and I can easily recognize the power of engaging the personal and the systemic in the process. I want to ask you about the challenges in this process, because I assume that getting to such shifts was involved with some challenges during the way along the process. So we would love to hear.
Especially as you mentioned that many of them to begin with, they kind of come from a more academic way of going about doing things, right?
Yeah.
So it's not...
Yes. Well, certainly that was one. We were really countercultural, but we did ask for permission. That's one thing that PI did so smart. When we came into the engagement, the agreement was we're going to be doing things that are different, that it's not the typical way of thinking about your future. And folks signed on to that. Niels, the leader who I told you about, he had a lot of credibility with the UN country team, and he trusted us. So he kind of led the way in doing things that were a little non-traditional, and others followed. But to your point of challenges, there were a couple really big ones. One was we learned midway through our planning that Niels, this resident coordinator, was going to retire in January. We were doing 2 in-person labs, one in November and a second one in January. The January one was the UN country team plus another 15 people, youth leaders, government leaders, civil society leaders, development folks. And he said, and I'm going to retire right at the end of that. And we're like, oh my God, should we even do this? That is a huge risk. I don't know what to tell you. He was determined. He said, we're going to do this. On my watch, this must be done. And we just made the decision in collaboration with the PI folks to really work with the incoming resident coordinator, who is coming from another African country and had gone through a lab of her own, not this lab. So happy to tell you how we handled that, but we just prayed that this strategy would work, because change in leadership right after, that is a mess. Another big challenge was, and this was huge, we would have good meetings with the core team, the PI team, but in between meetings, we could not get anybody's attention. We were about to go to Liberia. I have to tell you, for me personally, I had never been in Africa in my life. This was after COVID. I am not young any longer. I had lived out of the country before, so I hoped I could do it. I had never been to Africa. A week before we were going there, we did not know who was coming to this lab or where it was going to be held. And that was the pattern throughout. I think culture, bandwidth, whatever it was, we really had to just trust our partners on the other side and not know what was going to happen at each moment. And now that you're asking me that question, it's making me realize it built a little bit of a muscle in us, the PI team, to just stay really present and just see what was going to come with each step. But that was a big challenge. And then another big challenge was, I told you that national elections are a big deal. And we knew that like 8 months after the lab, there was going to be a national election for a new president, and that it mattered quite a bit, and that everybody's attention was going to be distracted by that. So those were some of the challenges, in addition to the usual ones of like figuring out the right design, but those were joyful challenges.
Yeah, but can you say a few words about the kind of obvious challenges? I think it might be very interested for the people who will listen to this piece, because the obvious, sometimes we think that it's only ours, but it's common, and to listen it, to hear it in your words and from your perspective might be very interesting for us, if you don't mind.
Do you mean the design challenges?
What some design challenges.
And even some challenges, I think, when people encounter Theory U, some are really cynical. I mean, I think, as you said, it's very countercultural. So how do you address that? I mean, how do you, and I'm sure there are others, but just as introducing work like Theory U and embodiment and stuff doesn't seem very trivial.
Yeah. I will say, I believed in us. I've been using Theory U as a frame for change for quite a while now, close to 20 years. And once I saw that we had the right leadership, that the leadership was behind us and trusting us, and once I saw that these people were really stuck and cared deeply, I wasn't so, I knew we could do something useful. It was just a question of exactly what we were going to do. And I would say the design team, Teo and Sharon and I, we were just listening very, very closely and customizing a set of practices that we've used over the years for the specifics of this situation. So some examples, like we knew that this idea of source and these people being in this for the right reasons was buried deep, deep, deep. It was there, but not available. Like we asked the core team at one point, how well do you know it? They said, oh, we're really a good team. We work closely together. You know each other really well? Yeah, we know each other really well. And I said, Niels, how many children does Comfort have? And that was someone else on the team. He said, I have no idea. And so what we discovered is that they had a collegial relationship, but not really personal. So we made the decision that's why we ask people to dedicate the work to someone so they could make visible their motivations, their deep motivations. We also realized that the whole, country narrative was important. And so these were some of the things we said, we have to bring that out in the beginning. I'll tell you, in our initial designs, I was tiptoeing, I was scared. Like, this is a violent country. People had gotten killed within the year before we were there for doing a study on why there was some millions of dollars lost on a highway building project. Like the consulting firm people got killed. I was, nervous about, I was not saying the word corruption out loud. Niels noticed that. He said, why aren't you saying corruption out loud? I said, oh, it's so scary. And he said, you have to. We have to name it. If we can't talk about these things, then we can't work with them. So I would say that there was a big dance between us PI people having these tools and the leadership there who were really committed and smart. So that was a thing. We decided, to your questions about SPT and using like embodiment practices, we decided that these were people that were going to be open to it, but we were going to take it bit by bit. We weren't going to overwhelm them or scare them from the beginning. So, and I am a person who's not a natural embodiment person, so I feel comfortable modeling. I think I'm a good example because I don't do it well. But from the very beginning, when people checked in, we said, okay, now I want to ask you this, you're going to think this is crazy, but I'm going to promise you that you have wisdom in your body that you're going to access by doing this. So I'm going to ask you, just make a gesture of how you're arriving. And I did something, you know, something a little bit that was obviously not elegant. And people laughed, you know, they wanted to have fun. And some people did it, and it broke the ice. And we had in our plans, you know, had a possibility of doing stuck. We ended up not doing stuck. We did some other small practices using embodiment in the first lab. But I'll tell you what we did in the second lab when we had about 25 to 30 people. And we just had, in the second lab, we shared the shifts, those 4 shifts that came out of the first lab. And because remember, now we have members of society. We got feedback on them. We had them rewrite them so they were more accurate, and we were really focused on prototypes. So we had invited people to be on a prototype team. So they were on that prototype team, and we had a sense, I don't know what to tell you, the 3 of us, we said, gosh, we really wish we could do 4D mapping. Should we do 4D mapping? All along, we're talking about it to one another. And in the end, we made the decision, yep, we're going to do 4D mapping. So we had a first draft of the prototype designs. And we said, now we're going to stop and do 4D mapping, and then we'll come back and see how that informs the designs. And what we did, again, I led the 4D mapping because whatever, it was me. And I said, okay, you've been amazing. You have embodied the you. You are now in graduate school. We're going to give you the PI practice that is one of the most, it takes such courage to do this, but it offers the deepest wisdom. And I explained 4D mapping, which is, you know, the practice where folks take on the roles of the ecosystem, embody them, and we go from sculpture 1 to sculpture 2. They took to it like fish to water. I think there's an assumption. I think what I take from this, most of the people, even though they weren't mostly Liberian, they were mostly African. There's just something about embodiment that is not the same leap and this is what people told me, in African cultures as it is in Western cultures. We had someone there who was a queen, it's not royalty officially, but she's designated the queen. She claimed the role of the land, and she laid down on the ground right away. There was, I mean, people, I had said when we were designing this, someone said, oh, we, you know, laid out all the roles, and someone said, there's no role for the disabled. We need the disabled to have a role. I said, we can't. There's too many roles. You're not going to be able to make sense of it. It's too much. No, we can't. It's like overwhelming. They pushed. They said, we need the disabled. Okay. So I figured they knew what they were talking about. So we had a role of the disabled. The person who took that role on sat outside the circle for sculpture 1. And I'll tell you the short version of the story is, by sculpture 2, that person who embodied the disabled was in the center of the sculpture. And I didn't realize that being disabled in Liberia isn't just about physical disability. It's also about all the disabilities and the trauma and the harm related to recovering from the war. Everyone in Liberia has somebody who were a child soldier themselves. They've had family loss. Like, everyone is disabled. So they came really naturally to that 4D mapping and actually had fun with it in our moment of courage.
Please, I would like to say that in Theory U, we speak about open heads, open hearts, and like open will, and kind of involving in our work our like head, heart, and hand. And I feel that listening to you, I feel that like in this conversation, you embody this wholeness, and it is very, very much inspiring. And I want to ask you kind of a personal question. I know that you are very much experienced in working in Theory U for like many years, but as I know you, you are a permanent learning person. And I'm curious to hear from you some things that you feel that you learned from leading this project or being involved in this project.
That question, Yael, and thank you for your observation about open mind, open heart, open will in us and the PI team is so spot on. I will say this experience I can't forget. Like I get emotional when I think about Liberia. It feels like, you know, you have these times in your life where you have the privilege of being placed someplace where you feel like you can be useful. And I feel like we were not perfect, but we were very useful. Teo, Sharon, and I, it's over a year later, and we kept in touch with one another. And we couldn't, you know, what we said to each other is we couldn't forget what happened there. It felt like we were being led like along this journey. Whenever we were confused, it felt like we were being led by something bigger than us. I don't want to use language that gets too woo-woo. I'm generally not a particularly woo-woo person, but it really did feel that way. And we said, well, that's great that we had an amazing experience. I wonder what happened in Liberia. So we went back a year later and interviewed people. And I'm happy to tell you about what we learned. But to your point, when we were debriefing just yesterday, we said to one another, one of the things that happened is we, the PI team, were called into having open mind, open heart, open will. And that we hadn't seen that as so clearly before as a condition for success in these U labs that we all do. You know, often you think about a facilitator as somebody who's neutral. We were not neutral. We cared deeply. We were careful about what was our work and what was the client system's work. We were very careful about that. But love was at play here. We felt love between ourselves and the people there. And we had to have courage because we didn't know what we were doing. Like you said earlier, like each step of the way, we didn't know what we were doing, but we felt responsible to do the best work we could, and that made us courageous. I think we're also a good team. Teo, Sharon, and me, we balance each other well. What did I learn? I mean, there's no end. Sometimes we're trying to write one article and I feel like it could be a book. I learned so much.
Mm-hmm. So maybe you said also about these conversations that you had a year after, which is actually, I think, not very conventional, that you actually go a year after to learn what happened. What did you learn from these conversations too? I think it'll be really illuminating.
It was amazing. We put a call out and we said, who would spend 30 minutes with us on the phone or on Zoom? 30 minutes to 45 minutes. We ended up talking with 9 people, a combination of people from the UN country team and from civil society. And then we also did a Zoom of the PI team. We did our own reflection. And after we did those interviews, we summarized what we learned and we shared it back with the UN, with the lab team to get, that's what we did. That was our little, just did it on our own. This was not a funded thing, although someone came back and found a little bit of funding for us. Here's what we learned. All 4 prototypes moved on and exist. So over a year later, they all launched, they all iterated, and they all continue on. They, you know, in some form or another, not in their original form, of course. That's the goal of a prototype, that it would morph. So that was really, we were really happy to hear that. We did not know if they all would have launched. And happy to tell you about them. They're each one of them fascinating and important. They were all like, to the criteria of a prototype, they were doable, but they were strategic. Each one of them was very important. That's one thing. Some of the other things that happened, a lot of people told us that they themselves were changed. They said the way that they go about their work was completely different. And a lot of those differences were around, for example, the guy who does the country plan. He typically would sit with his economic spreadsheets and all of his data and write a country plan. He'd talk to the leaders, write a country plan. He didn't do that. He went out and just began by talking with people and connecting with people in civil society in the different parts of the UN and developed it from conversation. People told us that when the UN had an instinct to do something on its own, instead the woman who was head of UN Women, she said, she goes to her partners now and is led by people in civil society as opposed to bringing my project. Another person talked about just like personal leadership, she shifted her model of leadership and now just walks around for, a half an hour in the morning and chatting with people, tuning into how they're feeling, as opposed to like getting to work. Everybody had a different story about the impact on themselves as a leader, but everyone said, I was changed. Or a lot of people, they got just a deeper understanding of the landscape of Liberia. So even as they were moving forward as leaders, they felt they could make wiser choices about how to partner, how to do their work. So there was a lot of personal, shift of mind, shifts in relationships, about strategy of going about their work. Everyone said shifts in relationships. They created new methods to bring outsiders into the UN infrastructure on a more regular basis. The biggest shift at all, the one that absolutely stunned us, is around the presidential election. We started writing to them during the course of the election saying, hey, do you want to get back together? And they said, sure, but after the election, which of course makes sense. And we had assumed, oh my gosh, we forgot about that election. Nothing will have changed. We couldn't have been more wrong. What they said to us was, those shifts that we decided on in that first lab and iterated in the second lab were just a gold mine for how we engaged with the process of the national election. For example, I told you they did a PR campaign around a new national narrative. They worked with the parties and said, I don't know what they did exactly, but all I know is that the winning party had a campaign slogan that exactly matches the theme that they were trying to create. This theme, and now I'm sure it's not causal and that if it weren't for us, it wouldn't have happened, but it was certainly reinforcing. And in fact, the theme of it's a new government, the government switch, the new government is very much currently in alignment with this one Liberia, responsibility to our future. I can't remember the words exactly. The other thing they did is, remember, the UN was very accustomed to intervening. They were the peacekeepers, they're the development people, they're delivering food. During the election, they said, no, we are not going to be involved in the election. Instead, and by the way, we had a new resident coordinator now. This is a woman who thankfully was wise and humble and came in and did not try to do a whole set of new things, but really listened to what came out of that lab and aligned with it. And she made the decision, we are going to support the election leaders who have the confidence of the country and who are, doing the right thing by democracy. And that's what they did. They backed off and did not intervene. They also brought in community groups and women's groups and all these groups to support the election results. Liberia, it was a runoff election. The new leader won by a razor's edge. There was a peaceful transfer of power. Liberian, the George Weah, the former president, won an award for transferring power peacefully. And it was a very successful election, and a lot of people decided to stay. They did not leave the country for fear of violence. And so now there's a new government. So I said, oh my gosh, new government, is that? And they said, no, our 4 shifts are our roadmap for how we're going to work with the new government. So who knew that would,
You beautifully demonstrated how the personal changes, the relationship change, and kind of that from there, you see the more systemic and ecosystemic changes. And I think that was really beautifully demonstrated. Yael, is there anything else, or we're gonna end at that?
Yeah, I think.
Liz, thank you so much for sharing so richly and candidly from your experience, and I've learned a lot. I'm sure everybody else will as well. We really appreciate it.
Yeah,
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for gathering these stories. I can't wait to listen to all of them. They've been fabulous.
Thank you very much.